Hi everybody, welcome to Chapter 24, Nutrition. First of all, I wanted to put up kind of this sample plate that's showing you how much of your plate should be fruits, grains, protein, vegetables, and dairy. And you can see the veggie is the largest portion, but in reality, usually are proteins and grains. Most people don't think about the fruit aspect as well. We got to have vitamin C from our fruits, and so we should be having a larger portion of fruit in our diet at every meal than we normally do, at least in the United States. If you want to learn more about this, you can go to choosemyplate.gov. Basically, if we need fuel for the body, right, to break things down, build things up, that's basically a nutrient, right? So any sort of substance that's in the food that we need to grow, maintain, or repair cells or organs in the body, right? We also have macronutrients. We've talked a lot about these, carbohydrates and lipids and proteins. All of them can be used as fuel sources for the body. Some micronutrients like vitamins and minerals are also necessary, but in smaller amounts. So for vitamins, think of vitamin A, C, K, D. We'll talk more about some of those coming up. Some of the minerals that would be required, we need iron for red blood cells. We need iodide for creating T3 and T4 thyroid hormones. We need calcium for our bones. We need sodium and potassium to set up our resting membrane potential. Also, water is technically a nutrient. Remember that water is going to split molecules or put them together. If you remember dehydration, synthesis, and hydrolysis way back from 201, so water is required. Then we have essential nutrients. So the nutrients that we have to get from food, that we don't synthesize on our own. So essential, something you have to get from food. Non-essential, which is on the next slide, is the nutrients that can be processed from consuming other nutrients. You can see here we've listed non-essential nutrients. So they're also vital, but if enough is not available, they can usually be synthesized. So think about vitamin K. If you don't consume enough vitamin K, your liver can actually synthesize it. And if you remember, vitamin K was important for creating clotting factors. And another one would be vitamin D, right? We can synthesize or activate vitamin D in our skin through exposure to sunlight. Again, here we have another definition. What's a calorie? Because usually we talk about how many calories of this or that you need to consume on a daily basis. Here's another kind of guideline for you. I like this one because it shows the person climbing the stairs. So it talks about how much of your plate should be, or your diet should be grain, how much should be vegetable, fruits, oils, milk, and then meat or beans of some sort. But this one is showing exercise as well. Here's our healthy eating pyramid. They change these up every year. They come out with kind of a new, fancier display of what healthy eating looks like. But I just want you guys to look at this, because here's the oils and the grains and the veggies, all the things we should be eating a lot of, and then the things we should be eating very little of, right? Are white rice, white bread, potatoes, pastas, your meat, right? Your dairy. This is all supposed to be the least of what you consume. And in America, in the United States, it's usually the upside down, right? All of this stuff probably makes up the base of our pyramid. So we're probably not eating as healthy as we should. For the next few slides, just go through these nutrients and make sure that it makes sense to you, that you recall some of these concepts that we've already talked about. So carbohydrates, where do they come from? Well, they come from starches, right? Grains, veggies. We have simple sugars in fruit, right? Glucose and fructose. What do we use carbohydrates for? Well, it's the major fuel used by the cells to generate ATP. Remember that our neurons rely almost exclusively on glucose. And remember that excess glucose is converted to glycogen and stored in the cells or in the liver. For lipids, realize that through our diet we consume triglycerides, and they can be saturated or unsaturated. I think there's a picture coming up, so we'll just hold off on those. Cholesterol, this is in egg yolk and meat, when we say organ meat that we consume as well. Shellfish, milk products. The liver makes about 85% of our cholesterol. So this is something that we don't really think about. If somebody talks about having high cholesterol, if your dietary cholesterol is really high and your liver's making cholesterol, that can make too much cholesterol. Here's an image of a triglyceride. It has a glycerol backbone, and then it has 3 fatty acid tails. So here we have saturated fats. So saturated fats are usually hard. They have every single carbon has a hydrogen attached to it. So you can see that the fatty acid tails form these rigid parallel structures. With the unsaturated fats, there's kind of a little kink in the tail because there is a double bond between the carbons. So not every carbon has a hydrogen attached. And these kinks in the tail allow the fat or triglyceride to stay in kind of a more liquid form. So think of saturated as usually a hard fat, and then an unsaturated fat is usually a liquid fat. And even though we think of lipids as bad things, right? Usually if somebody says, oh, my cholesterol is really high, we think that's terrible. Well, we do need some cholesterol, right? Why do we make cholesterol? Why does the liver make 85% of the cholesterol? Well, remember, cholesterol stabilizes membranes. If you remember, we shove cholesterol into our phospholipid bilayer to make it a little bit more stable, right? Some of our steroid hormones are made or based on cholesterol. Our bile salts that are released from the gallbladder. The phospholipid cell membrane, right? And then also adipose or fat offers protection and insulates places like our abdominal cavity, around our spinal cord. If you remember, we have that epidural fat kind of space. So I don't want you to think that all lipids are bad. If somebody said, I'm not going to consume any lipids at all whatsoever, that doesn't mean that's a good thing, right? So everything in moderation. And proteins we seem to be pretty familiar with, right? We think of animal products that we eat like meat, but you can also get protein from beans. So that's why earlier it said proteins or beans. So if you eat an animal product like a piece of steak, it has all the essential amino acids that you need in order to make every protein in the body. If you consume just beans, legumes, nuts, and cereal, they contain incomplete proteins. They're going to lack some of the essential amino acids, each of these individually. So if you just ate beans, that's not enough. If you just ate nuts, that's not enough. If you just ate cereals or rice, that's not enough. But if you link some of these together, then you can get all of the essential amino acids that you need. So what we're saying is you can eat beans and rice, and now you have all the essential amino acids that you need consumed by the food that you're eating. If you don't have beans and rice, you need to be eating a meat or a fish product to get all of the essential amino acids that are needed in your diet. Here's a list. You don't have to memorize these. I just think this is a really nice list that they give you. Here are the amino acids that are essential, that you need to consume in order to make every protein in the body. So you can see if you just eat corn, you're missing these 2. And if you just eat beans, you're missing these 2 amino acids. But if you eat both of these together, now you get all of your total essential amino acid needs. So this is why in a lot of food cultures where meat is not prevalent, you'll always see beans and rice together on the menu. Hopefully by now we know how important proteins are. We know that they make structural material for us, right? Keratin, collagen, elastin, all of our muscles, right? Cardiac, skeletal, smooth, all use proteins, right? Remember myosin and actin. And then we also have these functional proteins like enzymes, like sucrase that breaks down sucrose. Some of our hormones are protein-based. So I want to clear up that you can use a protein as a fuel source if you have no carbohydrates or fats, but it takes a lot out of you. So I'll talk a little bit later about some of these diets where they say, oh, just eat proteins, right? You still need to consume a little bit of carbohydrates and a little bit of fat. But if you ate nothing but a protein diet, you're putting a lot of stress and strain on your liver and your kidneys. We've already talked about vitamins in the digestion chapter, But realize that vitamins are nutrients. Some of them act as coenzymes, meaning that some vitamins have to be present in order for certain enzymes to work. So vitamin D, they just list some made in the skin. Some of the vitamin B's and K's can be synthesized by the bacteria that's in your gut. And remember, some of the food that we use, we're going to pull some of the vitamins out. And they mention here beta carotenes and the vitamin A that you need for retinal health. So no one food group contains all of the vitamins. We're kind of getting vitamins from various sources. This is a nice list of the minerals that we need moderate amounts of in order to maintain health. So calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chloride, and magnesium. We haven't really talked about magnesium or sulfur, but magnesium is also going to help with muscle contraction, specifically cardiac. Other minerals we're only going to need in real trace amounts, tiny little amounts, right? And this uptake and excretion are going to be balanced. And this is where your kidneys will come into play. So when we talk about the urinary system, we'll talk more about these. But if you have too much calcium or sodium or chloride or magnesium, it can be released in the urine. A few more definitions for us. We need to know metabolism is all of the biochemical reactions that happen inside of our cells involving nutrients, right? If we're going to build large molecules from small ones, that's anabolism. So if I have two monomers and I want to put them together and make a polymer, that's anabolism. Catabolism, hydrolysis, split with water of complex structures. So if I have a polymer and I want to make it two monomers, I'm going to do cannibalism. Catabolism, not cannibalism, right? Cellular respiration. Hopefully I do not have to go over this again, right? Breaking down glucose and taking the energy out of glucose and turning it into ATP molecules. This is another nice figure from the textbook that shows you where each of these can enter into cellular respiration. So if you remember, these are the 4 steps of cellular respiration. We have glycolysis, where we break down the glucose initially. We have this PrEP, this acetyl-CoA that's added so that the pyruvic acid can get into the Krebs cycle. And then we go from Krebs cycle to oxidative phosphorylation, if you remember the electron transport chain. You don't have to know all of these. I just wanted you to see that if you consume proteins like steak or eggs, that we break the proteins down into amino acids, and that can happen or be brought into cellular respiration to generate ATP at several different levels. Carbohydrates is the easiest way to generate ATP, but you can also use fats and proteins to generate ATP as well. We've talked about these terms many times. I just want to make sure that you go back and pay attention to them again. So what is glycogenesis? That's glycogen formation if you have excess glucose, right? So if you don't need the glucose to make ATP, you're going to store it as glycogen. Where are you going to do that? Liver, and also in the cells, usually skeletal muscle. Then we have glycogenolysis. So this is the breakdown of glycogen. So we can store glycogen if we have extra glucose, and then we can break down that glycogen if we have low glucose. You should go back and think about the hormones that kind of regulate some of this as well. Sorry. And then also gluconeogenesis. Remember that sometimes if we don't have enough glucose, that we can form it from non-carbohydrate sources. This should automatically make you think of cortisol that we talked about back in chapter 16. I would know these terms as well, lipogenesis and lipolysis. Also, I wanted to mention this because you might have heard of ketone bodies if you've heard anybody talking about dieting. So if you have excess fatty acid or stored fatty acid that you want to break down, so you're doing lipolysis, it can be converted in the liver to something called ketone bodies. And these ketone bodies are floating around in your blood, and they can make your blood acidic. So you're breaking down fatty acids too fast, maybe, and these ketone bodies are floating around in your bloodstream, and they're messing with your pH level. So if you remember, we had to keep our blood pH around 7.35 to 7.45 for a lot of the proteins and enzymatic action that's happening in our blood. So this is common in starvation. So if you're not consuming any glucose or any food at all, your body's going to use all your glucose first, and then it's going to start breaking down fats, and it's going to be breaking them down rapidly. You could also have ketone bodies if you're not dieting properly, right? You've just decided, okay, I'm going to not consume any food for 7 days. Again, your body's going to use all the glucose first, and then it's going to start breaking down fats a lot. We're going to be doing a lot of lipolysis. And so you're going to have a lot of ketone bodies in your blood. This can also happen from diabetes. Remember, diabetes, you're not able to bring the glucose inside of the cell. So whether it's because of insulin not being released or your cells not responding to insulin, but basically you cannot get the glucose into the cells. So basically your cells think that they're starving and we start breaking down fat. This can also affect your breathing. So we're going to talk about how the metabolic and breathing are related. But basically, if your blood is becoming very acidic, your body tries to rapidly breathe off and release the carbon dioxide to raise the pH. We're going to talk about how these two are connected when we get to chapter 26. So just to summarize what we need carbohydrates and lipids for, right? Not just the nutrients, but we need them for structural materials, right? So lipid structural roles. What do we need lipids to do? We need phospholipids in order to build cell membranes. Remember, lipids are also an important part of the myelin sheath that covers your neurons and allows for faster signals, right? That's saltatory conduction. Cholesterol we need for cell membranes. We need lipids for steroids. So those are some of the hormones that we have, like estrogen, testosterone, progesterone. And then the liver is going to use cholesterol to form the bile salts, which are going to get concentrated in the gallbladder and help us break down fats in our diet. We also have to talk about how important it is to break down proteins, because the proteins that we consume, we have to break them down to their simplest parts, which are the amino acids. So we consume a steak, we break it down into individual amino acids, we reabsorb those in the small intestines, and then we recycle them into new proteins. So if you're building muscle, if you're lifting weights and you're building muscle in your biceps brachii, you're going to consume meat, you're going to break down that protein into individual amino acids, and then your body is going to build new muscle, and you need more actin and more myosin to do that. So proteins are not stored in the body. It's not like carbohydrates and lipids where we can store excess and use it for fuel later. Proteins, when they're in excess, are going to be flushed out of the system. So we can oxidize them and use them to make some energy. We can convert some of them into fats and then store. So what I said might have been a little complicated there, but you don't take proteins and store them as proteins. The only thing you can do is if you have excess proteins, you can convert them into fat and then you can store them as fat. The rest are going to be excreted as urine. So we do a little bit of this and we can do a lot of this, right? So what I'm saying is if you're consuming, kind of relate it back to the diet, if you're consuming protein only, some of it can be used as energy, some of it's going to be stored as fat, and some of it's going to be excreted in your urine. So I don't want you to go into great detail with this slide, but I just want you to see how your liver and your kidneys are working overtime if you're consuming lots of proteins. So if you have a lot of proteins taken in through your diet and you use some of it as energy, you store some of it as fat, all the leftover bulk has to be processed by your liver and your kidneys. And urea, we'll talk about in the urinary system, is one of the products that's excreted in the urine that comes from the breakdown of proteins. So if you had high urea in your urine, that would mean your liver and your kidneys are working to break down lots of proteins. So again, this is why that high protein diet for an extended period of time is not really a great idea. You're really taxing your liver and your kidneys. So we're constantly in this dynamic state of absorptive. We just ate, right? We consumed a meal and now our small intestines are trying to absorb the nutrients. So we switch between absorptive state and post-absorptive state. This is when the GI tract is empty. You've absorbed all of the nutrients from the food that you've consumed and moved the rest on to be excreted as waste. This is a nice slide that kind of just shows you what's happening in the absorptive state. So remember, this is we've consumed food and we've broken it down and now we've absorbed the nutrients in the small intestine. So glucose is going to be converted to glycogen or to fat. Glycerol and fatty acids are going to be converted to triglycerides. The amino acids are going to be taken up by cells so that we can make proteins. And the excess amino acids can be used for ATP synthesis or stored as fat, or they can be pushed out if there's too much protein, right? Pushed out in the urinary system. When you're in the post-absorptive state, there's no food in your GI tract, right? You've processed all the food. So they think of this as kind of the fasting phase, but it's not really fasting. It's after you've absorbed all the food, or nutrients, I guess would be a better term. So during this time, you're using your fats for energy. You could also be making glucose available in the bloodstream, right? You could break down the stored glycogen in your liver. Remember, that's called GlycoGenesis. We could also break down the stored glucose in the skeletal muscles, and then we could also break down the fat, do lipolysis from the adipose tissues and from the liver. So if you're in a fasting state and you need energy, this is what you're going to do. In this post-absorptive or fasting state, glucagon, sorry, couldn't get it out. Glucagon is going to be released, right, if you have declining blood glucose levels and rising amino acid levels. So glucagon, remember, is the hormone that's released from the pancreas that goes to the liver and tells it to break down glycogen and release glucose into the bloodstream. You can also, if you have prolonged fasting, that's going to cause glucose sparing. Remember, your brain wants glucose almost exclusively. It doesn't really want to use fats or proteins as a fuel source. So prolonged fasting, you're going to see glucose saved for the brain. You're going to see increased fat breakdown or lipolysis. And it also has been shown to inhibit insulin. So it's telling your cells not to take glucose in, right? Save that glucose kind of for the brain. So there have been some recent studies that say that intermittent fasting is actually good for you. So if you wanted to, you could read up on that. I'm kind of the idea that anything in moderation is good. I don't think you should be fasting for days, but if you fast for 4 to 5 hours every day, I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. Another slide here explaining some of the clinical issues with diabetes. So remember, diabetes is either you don't make enough insulin or there's something wrong with the insulin receptors on your cells. This results in unavailability of glucose, right? You're going to have high glucose blood levels, and then most of the glucose is going to be lost in your urine. And remember, I talked about those ketone bodies. So what's going to happen, you're going to start breaking down proteins and fats and trying to use those for energy instead, and that's going to cause your blood to become more acidic. And then you could also have proteins being broken down that we don't want broken down. So when it says protein wasting, we said first you use carbs, then you use fats, and the last thing that you're going to use as a food source is proteins if you absolutely have to. But do we really want our skeletal muscle breaking down to use those proteins as a fuel source? Probably not, right? So this is why we also see this kind of rapid weight loss. We see protein wasting, so smaller muscles, and then we see acidic blood pH levels. And all of this is not good for your organ systems.